We've had trouble with Zoom cameras this evening, so hopefully let's welcome Kara.
Yay! Welcome, Kara.
That was the biggest win of the evening. Oh no.
Oh no. You're playing with us now.
No, that was my accident. I accidentally flicked on the button, so sorry about that.
Oh, and Kara, can you just tell everybody where you're joining us from? Well, it's our evening, but it's actually your morning.
Yes. Yeah, it's almost noon, midday here in Pasadena, California, which is part of Los Angeles. So I'm in Southern California in the US.
Brilliant. Now,
and I'm coming from my dining room, which doubles as a drum studio. There's a drum kit just over to the side. So welcome to the world of parenting teenagers. Everything is multi-purpose.
Oh, fantastic. Now, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Kara Powell has done some extensive research over the years and works for the Fuller Institute. And Sam and I are really big fans, which is why we've called her on tonight. We love this book here. So if you are a church leader, you've got to read Growing Young if you want your church to be full of young people. If you are a parent, we would recommend Growing With. And tonight, though, we are looking at Kara's latest book, 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager, which is really for anybody who wants to have better conversations with young people. It's a really
Sticky Faith as well. Sticky Faith. How often do you? I still quote Sticky Faith all the time. All the time.
So it's brilliant that you're here with us, Kara. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the research that went on for your 3 Big Questions book?
Yeah, and I'd love to answer Debbie's great question in chat about what is Fuller FYI. So Fuller Theological Seminary is a large, primarily evangelical seminary where we're located. We have 3 campuses in the US, but we have students from over 70 nations, which is so exciting for us. And in particular, while I'm a faculty member at Fuller, my major jobs are I'm the chief of leadership formation. So I oversee all of Fuller's non-academic training. And then particularly for today and our conversation, I'm the executive director of the Fuller Youth Institute, or FYI. And our mission is to equip diverse leaders and parents. So I love how many of you are leading in some way, your parents, your caregivers, your grandparents. We want to equip diverse leaders and parents so that faithful young people can change our world. I'm a mom of 3 myself. Our oldest is 21. Our youngest is 19, and she's in her first year of college here in the US, but she's studying in London next fall. So you're going to get my daughter and probably almost for sure our whole family coming over to London and seeing some of Great Britain for sure. And then we also have a 15-year-old. So we have 2 college students who are not living with us and our 15-year-old who's in 10th grade here. And so I am living these questions. I am living youth ministry. I am living parenting of young people every day. And, you know, my job at Fuller is decently complicated, but it is a piece of chocolate cake compared to parenting. In fact, just yesterday was just one of those days where our kids were needing us in new ways and having challenges. And I looked at my husband last night and I said, wow, today has been a tough day of parenting. And so for the 50% of you who are parenting, I'm certainly living that. And then we're very involved in our church, Lake Avenue Church in Pasadena, where I help out with a number of ministries, including in student ministry.
Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the things we love about the work of Fuller and your books is they're research-based. They're not just good ideas, but they're based on your research. Could you tell us the research that got us to this book?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that, Sam. And I didn't really cover that, even though Ike asked me that before. So thank you for asking me a second time. So what we do in order to equip leaders and parents is we turn research into resources. And we love looking at theological research as well as social science, behavioral research, and then turning it into a practical tool that any adult who cares about young people can use. And so for this book, 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager in particular, we went both wide and we went deep. So we went wide, and these were with all kids living in the US right now. Wide, we looked at surveys and did interviews and focus groups with about 2,200 teenagers in the US. But then we paired that with a really deep dive with 27 diverse teenagers in the US, where we did about 6 hours of interviews with each of them, not all in one sitting, usually in at least 3 different chunks, to really understand what are they navigating, what are they feeling, what are they thinking, and just peel back the layers. Here in the US in 2020, in the midst of everything else that happened in our world in 2020, we crossed an interesting line where now, for those under 18, we are 50% young people of color and 50% young people who are white. And so we definitely wanted to reflect the full ethnic diversity of our world and the US in our sample. So of the 27 teenagers we interviewed, 20 are young people of color and 7 of the teenagers were white. Which just brought so much richness and depth to our conversations and to our understanding.
Thank you. So I think we should get on to some of the detail of what's inside the book now. And it's all about questions. And I suppose one reflection, in our sort of contemporary lifestyle, teenagers have access to all sorts of knowledge through their phone. They can access absolutely everything. But I guess what do you think the church is missing out on by reaching young people by asking the wrong questions? How are we missing out as churches?
Yeah, well, that's really the fundamental need that really drove the book, Aika. In fact, we tell a story of a 15-year-old who said this. It was kind of his drop the mic moment. I wish this church would stop answering questions I'm not asking. I wish the church would stop answering questions I'm not asking. And I think we can put other nouns in there for church. I wish my family, my parents, I wish my school, I wish my small group would stop answering questions I'm not asking. And so, as adults, we are doing our best. I mean, you who work with young people or volunteer, I know you're working so hard. And I know the pandemic has been challenging. We're doing our best. And yet, we're often not well, normally I say in the strike zone. Can I say that? I don't know if there's a cricket counterpart. What would be the counterpart in cricket?
I'd sit on target and at the stumps.
Okay, great. Okay, so in the strike zone. Okay, yeah, there we go. Or there's the cricket term. We're often missing the strike zone, as we would say in baseball, of what young people need. And so no wonder the church feels irrelevant to young people, because maybe we are, if we're not really understanding what they're wrestling with. And I think a lot of times we stop at a superficial level. We look at what young people are doing with technology. We look at what young people are navigating with mental health, just to name 2 really, really important areas that we need to be talking about with young people these days. And yet, even with those 2 very deep personal areas, what we found is that there are deeper questions. There are deeper questions that we don't often get to. And that's really what drove the book, is how can we help any adult really know the deepest questions young people are wrestling with, so that we can journey with them and point them to Jesus's best answers to those questions.
That's something which I think we hear and feel in our churches, is a sense of, we have young people, but we don't feel like we have a connection. And I think that's really difficult. And so the obvious question, the launch of that is, where's the place to start? How do you start having better conversations with young people? Yeah, well,
I'll give a bit more bad news and then I'll give some good news, if I may, Sam. Mm-hmm. There's just some recent research that's come out, and I'm just so much more familiar with US teenagers, but the researcher in me is going to keep saying US teenagers to just make clear what sample we're talking about. So there's just some recent research on US teenagers done by Springtide Research Institute that looked at teenagers of all faith persuasions. So not just kids from any one particular persuasion like Christianity, but all faith persuasions. During the pandemic, only 10% of US teenagers were contacted by a leader from the faith community. 10%, only 1 out of 10 kids heard from a leader in the faith community. Now that just breaks my heart as an adult who cares about kids. That's the bad news. But here's the good news, Sam, and it relates to your question, is that in that same sample of teenagers across the US, 70% of them were now more eager and open and appreciative to an adult relationship. Like in the midst of coming out of the pandemic, or whatever phase we are in the midst of the pandemic, young people, they've been isolated, they've been lonely, they've been bored, they've been separated. And so I really feel like this is a divine window for us as adults, those of us over 30, or even in our 20s sometimes, to really listen and build that relationship with young people. So in terms of how to start, I mean, first, I just want to point out the good news is know that young people want a relationship. Sometimes more than they even show. They want to be able to talk to you. And I was just reminded yesterday that a lot of times we assume the answer from a young person is going to be no to wanting to talk or spend time with us. And often the answer is yes. So I just got an email yesterday from a youth pastor who's working through some training related to these questions. And he's in Florida. And he said, you know what? I felt like God prompted me to go reach out to a 12th grader who's kind of drifting from our youth ministry and see if he wanted to start getting together. And, a lot of times if somebody's drifting from our ministry, from our small group, from our church, we almost drift because we feel awkward about it. We don't know how to talk to him about it. But he said, hey, would you like to start meeting together? And maybe we could look together at the book of John. Not only did this 12th grader say yes, but the 12th grader had all these ideas for how they could study the book of John together, simply because Ian, this youth pastor, asked this 12th grader. So I would say the first thing we need to do is to not assume that young people are closed, but know that even though at any given moment, sometimes on particular days, sometimes particular weeks, they might seem closed, they're often really more open than they are closed. And then the second thing that I would say in terms of your question of how do we have a better conversation is we have to listen. We have to listen. And a lot of times we as adults, we're thinking about what we're going to say next. We're thinking about what's next on our calendar. And we miss out on the depth, on those threads that a young person might bring up, that we have that chance to pull on that thread a little bit. But if we're not really listening to what they're navigating, we don't even see the thread and we just move on to the next thing. So those would be just a couple things. Is start with the assumption that they want to connect, and maybe they won't at that moment, but start with the assumption that they want to connect. And then it all starts with listening.
And so, Kara, what do you think are some of the obstacles to us being really good at intentional listening and that empathy that teenagers want?
Yeah, we're busy. We are busy. And it's interesting how many of you said you were parents. I believe about 50% of you said you were parents. So, you're juggling all sorts of things. Tonight, you've probably juggled dinner and homework and you're getting your kids to where they need to be. And, you're just kind of trying to survive that family ritual, that the daily life management of your family. And so it's often hard to look that young person in the eye and have a conversation. So I would say we're busy. We're distracted for those of us who are small group leaders or pastors or teachers. We're not navigating dinner, but we're thinking about the next thing we have to do and whatever we have do next. And, what's going to happen at the end of this small group or this class or whatever it might be. And so we're constantly distracted. And then I think we have our own agendas for our kids. Like we know what we want them to do. And a lot of times we let that be in the driver's seat. And if you've been in a conversation where it feels like someone has an agenda, have you enjoyed that conversation? Generally not very much. And I don't mean like a business agenda. I mean, somebody has a plan for you. They're trying to get you someplace and it just becomes totally obvious. A lot of times we as adults, we're a little too, shall I say, forceful in how we're trying to steer the conversation, and kids pick up on that. And so, I've tried to change a lot of the tone that I use with kids. Is it's more like, well, gosh, I'm curious about that. Or I was just talking to a young person who was saying something that felt a little, quite honestly, different from how I think scripture talks about that subject. And I knew this young person was a follower of Jesus. And so I said to them, okay, you've just said A, and I'm curious, how does, what you just said in A relate to what I think scripture has to say in this passage that feels like B? And so that phrase, I'm curious, is a really helpful one to help us actually be curious, be perceived as curious, and not steer the conversation in a way that's off-putting to a young person.
We've just had an interesting question in the Q&A saying, would you have a good lead-in question for opening up a conversation if you're not sure where to start, trying to avoid the eye roll or the shrug and things like that? What's your best opening question, Kara?
Wow, best opening question. Well, it depends on if it's somebody that I know well, and it depends a lot on the context. But I think just simply asking, let's say it's a church meeting, a youth ministry meeting. I don't know the young person particularly well. I might go up to them and say, wow, what was the best part of your day so far? And let them describe one thing about their day. And then, I love this question about what's the first question. I actually think it's often the second question that's more important, because the second question is where we go deeper. And so, what was the best part of your day? Oh, it's when, I did well on an English test, way better than I thought I was going to do. Here's a great follow-up. In fact, one of my colleagues who I respect greatly, he's painted this as a sign in his living room for his family that has his three daughters in it. And it's tell me more. Tell me more. Those 3 words, tell me more. Oh, wow, you did well in your English test. Well, tell me a little bit more about it. And then you might hear what they're studying in English. You might hear about some of the stress that English puts on them. Oh, wow, that sounds really stressful. Tell me more about what you navigate in terms of all the stress at school. And all of a sudden, in just 2 conversations, in two responses from me, we've gone from an English test to really talking about stress. So that phrase, tell me more, keep that in your hip pocket. And I use it with adults too, honestly, but it's especially helpful with teenagers.
I just realized that this afternoon with my own son, I did exactly all these things wrong. Oh, well done.
Well, and Sam, let me just say, the good news is Jesus's grace is bigger than all of our mistakes as leaders and parents. And one of the themes in our research, especially from Sticky Faith, is, oh my goodness, I apologize to my kids so much. In fact, just yesterday, I apologized to, our one kid at home, our 15-year-old. And I said, I think I sounded like I was nagging you there, huh? And she said, yeah, you did. And I said, I'm really sorry about that. And so I apologize so much to my kids. So, and I think that's great to model. So let's keep apologizing to young people.
I'll just go.
Yeah, exactly. See you in about 5 minutes, Sam. Or actually, we could just go with you and we could record it and then we could watch it all and dissect it.
That would
sounds
be
awesome.
remarkable. That would be a remarkable turn for the evening. If my son came on and I apologized for.
Even better than Boba Fett.
All I did was I did the leading conversation. But he said he went to the library at lunchtime to do his homework. And I did that thing because I used to do loads of schools work. And I used to know that kids who do, often if they're in the library at lunchtime, they're hiding from something scary on the playground.
Right.
So I asked all these questions when really all he was doing was going to the library at lunchtime to do his homework. And I was so worried there was something I needed to know and there was nothing to be known. Oh, well done.
Man. I'll tell you, I'll just share another one for this. I read this in a book once, and I say this at least once a week to one of my kids, at least, and probably at least 2 or 3 times. In fact, just this past weekend, our 15-year-old, I knew she had homework. I knew she needed to study for some tests. I knew she had some church events. And normally I'm like, okay, well, tell me your schedule. When are you going to get your homework done? How are you going to study for the test? Et cetera. I do that. But instead, this is another great three-word phrase, or really a question. Well, what's your plan? What's your plan for the evening? What's your plan? What's your plan for cleaning your room? What's your plan for getting that college application due? That, it just feels way less naggy, like I'm nagging my kids, and it gives them agency. Okay, I'm honoring you. You're going to come up with a plan. I'm just curious about what it is. So that's been another really good one for me. So.
So there's the book is 3 big questions. So, and you say that for young people, there are 3 particular questions they're seeking answers to. So it'd be great to talk about some of those questions before we run out of time while I'm just hearing stories from my own parenting. So the first one is who am I? Is the first question. Yeah. Could you just share a bit about why you think it's difficult for young people to find the answer to that question?
Yeah. So I'll do a reveal here and share all 3 questions just in case anybody has to drop off, but then we'll unpack each, in 5 or 10 minutes per question. So the 3 big questions are identity, who am I? Belonging, where do I fit? And purpose, what difference can I make? So identity, belonging, and purpose. Who am I? Where do I fit? And what difference can I make? And so, these are questions that not just teenagers are wrestling with or 20-somethings are wrestling with. Those of us who are a little bit older are also wrestling with them. It's just that for us, they're more at a low simmer, whereas for young people, they're at kind of a constant rolling boil. And so identity, why is that such a pressing question? Well, part of what we did, Sam and Ika and everybody, is as we spent time with these kids, like we tried to understand how are they currently answering these questions? What are they kind of clinging to for current answers? And then what's a better Jesus-centered answer? And so let's start with their current answers to identity. What was fascinating is how the teenagers were interviewed, 2 major themes in their current answers. Number 1, they felt like there's so many different people they have to please. So there's who my family wants me to be, my nuclear family, my extended family. There's who my school or my teachers want me to be. There's who my friends want me to be. There's who church wants me to be. There's who my employer wants me to be. There's who my sports team wants me to be, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's like all these theaters of action that they feel like they're performing in, all of whom are defining them. And that just gets exhausting, which ties to the second major theme is when it comes to identity and who am I, young people, oh my goodness, we heard this time and time again, they just don't feel like they're enough. They don't feel like they measure up. They don't feel like they cross that bar. They don't feel smart enough. They don't feel popular enough. They don't feel attractive enough. Again, we studied so many young people who are young people of color, and especially Latino and Black young people, also Asian young people don't feel Latino, Black, or Asian enough as they're navigating multiple worlds. And so just this constant feeling of insecurity and inferiority is sadly what a lot of people navigate when it comes to their identity.
So, obviously, teenagers are massively immersed in the world of social media. What kind of role do you think that has to play in this sort of identity crisis?
Yeah, great question, Ika. So, I'm pro technology. It's what's allowing me to be however many thousand miles away I am from you and for us to have this conversation. So there's a lot I love about technology. Technology can also, of course, have its downsides. And especially when it comes to identity, the real beauty of social media, for instance, is kids do get to kind of experiment a little bit with who they are, and think about, what they want to curate, what they want to show on their social media, what they want to post. So there's something really positive about that. The negative about that is it's easy to look at everybody else's posts and feel like they're doing so much better. They're more attractive, have more friends, whatever it might be, than you do. And so it's easy to feel worse about yourself when you look on social media. Honestly, I don't check social media on Friday or Saturday nights because I go on, it's like, everybody else seems to be having a great time and people out on dates or whatever. And I'm in sweats and we're having leftovers and, watching whatever we can find on Netflix. So my husband and I. And so, it affects me, let alone, imagine being 14, 18. And so I think social media, there's some opportunities to experiment and explore, which is great. But often young people, and there's research on this, they walk away from time on social media feeling worse about themselves.
We discovered our next door neighbours are a lot cooler than us on social
Yes,
media.
absolutely.
That's been very difficult to come to terms with, that they're just plain cooler than us.
Yeah.
They were just the people next door, and then we found them. We discovered they work in media, and
yeah. Yeah, we have,
everyone,
in Los Angeles, there's a lot of people in the entertainment industry who are way more cool than us. But then Sam, I mean, there's also like, okay, if I'm going to post a picture, I just did this recently. I posted a picture of myself holding a book. Like I took 6 pictures and just a selfie, and I'm going to post the best one. And that's what we do in social media, right? Like we tend to take multiple of things and post whatever makes us look best. So, if you're watching that, if you're checking it out on your phone or your device, you compare the best of what you're seeing in others to the worst of what you know about yourself. Yeah. So no wonder we often feel like we're not enough.
Do you feel like the church has a contribution to answering that question? Is there a Christ-centered answer that could be part of that conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think sadly, sometimes the church contributes to it because we can have a performance culture at our church and make kids feel like they don't measure up. And this is the good news. I mean, what separates Christianity from every other religion is grace. It's not about, who we are. It's not about what we do. It's about what Christ has done for us. And so, the Jesus-centered answer that we offer in our book is that Jesus makes you enough. In fact, Jesus makes you more than enough. And this is really personal for me. I mean, I pray 10 prayers for myself every morning. And out of our research, this is one of them, that I will know that Jesus makes me enough. Because it's interesting. I don't struggle with that so much as a leader, but I do struggle with that as a parent. Because just like you, Sam, I mean, you blew it with your son today with the library. I blew it with my daughter. It's only noon here, so I haven't seen my daughter that much. She's been at school most of the day, so I haven't blown it yet. But I sure did yesterday, and so and I needed to apologize. And so parenting is just constantly revealing to me all my struggles, and that's where I just need to know that Jesus makes me more than enough as a parent. So that's one of the things that I regularly pray for myself.
I'd like to think about the questions around belonging you raise in the books now. And why do you think that the whole area of belonging is so important for our teenagers?
Yeah, and so I'm glad you transitioned to that. So identity is the first question, belonging is the second question. It's interesting. There's at Fuller Seminary where I teach, I'm part of the School of Mission and Theology, but there's also a School of Psychology. And some of my psychology faculty colleagues there, they actually would say that belonging leads the way of the three, that the way that we belong or don't belong, our journey in belonging has so much impact on the other two, on identity and on purpose, which we'll get to in just a bit. So we kind of hint at that in the book. I'm not totally willing to stack hands on that, but needless to say, it is so important. God has made us social people. God is a social person if you look at the Trinity. And so, constantly relating to different parts, different aspects of who God is. And we have the same opportunity to constantly relate to different people here. So, I mean, whatever field of research you look at, belonging, relationship, socialization, et cetera, is just so important. And for young people, how they feel about their life is so connected to how connected they feel to others. And so belonging, yes, we put it second, but and we didn't put them in any particular order, but some of my colleagues think it's actually the most important question.
This is my point in the evening when I get to say it all comes down to Westerhoff and his faith development. It's all about belonging, isn't it? We're not allowed to do one of these things without me talking about Westerhoff at some point. So I'm glad.
Got it. Good. Well, I'm glad we've got our mention there. That's important.
I'm glad we got that done. Yes, excellent. I mean, it's really fascinating, this belonging thing, because I think if you said to a lot of churches, do young people belong here? They would say unquestionably yes, but the evidence seems to be young people aren't feeling it.
Yeah,
and the young people aren't feeling what the church thinks they are saying about young people. So, have you got any thoughts on how a church could provide that belonging and how perhaps we get it wrong?
Well, I think you pinpointed something really important. And I was just looking at some research on family, and the same is true for church. It's not about what we think as adults, it's about what kids think that really matters in terms of what they experience. So yeah, we might think, oh, we have a very friendly, welcoming, hospitable youth ministry with a lot of kids who are close. But if kids aren't feeling that way, then that's ultimately what's more determinative. In terms of creating belonging, probably the best thing I can do is tell you a story of a church that is in Chicago. And they were really intrigued with these three questions of identity, belonging, and purpose. They heard us train about them even before the book came out. Well, the pandemic hits, and this church was a large church. They had about 200 teenagers coming to youth group. But the pandemic hits.
We must say, in our diocese is normal.
Yeah, sure. Right. Exactly. But they had, so it was definitely a large church, but the principles still apply. So let me, I think it's still a good illustration. So 200 teenagers, the pandemic hits, they go to Zoom for youth ministry, and that 200 drops to 100, which was really typical here in the US, that however many kids were showing up in person, for small group, my daughter was in a small group. We used to meet at our house. It was like eight girls in person every Sunday night. The pandemic hits, they go on Zoom, and it's cut to 4. So, kind of that 50% drop was just really, really common when things moved to virtual, not universal, but common. And so this 200 person youth ministry went down to 100, and the church was in part of our training. And so we said, you got to listen to kids. You got to listen to kids. And so they spent time with young people and really try to figure out, like, what do they most need? Identity, belonging, purpose, like, what are they most hungry for? And they realized, they're most hungry for belonging. And so this church would have said they prioritize small groups. But when the youth pastor was honest, he said, we really give about 5% of our energy to small groups. And so they said, what if we dramatically change that and give not 5% of our energy to small groups, but 95% of our energy to small groups? Recruited leaders, trained leaders better, really encourage kids to get into small groups. Well, this group that, again, a large group that started at 200 and then dropped to 100 is now about 400 teenagers who are in small groups, because this church, and any church, regardless of size, context, can do this, can listen to what kids need, and then can think about, gosh, what is it that we can offer in order to respond to that need? In the case of this church, it was small groups, which I think is often a helpful way to respond to young people's hunger for belonging. They want to have deep conversations. They want to be able to ask tough questions. They want to be in a safe environment. And so that was a process of one church that I think is replicable. Even if small groups don't become what you emphasize, it's listening and then prayerfully discerning, how are we going to meet young people's questions and needs?
I know one of the issues that we have in our churches in the UK is the sort of transition from sort of children and family stuff into youth stuff. And I know as young people go to secondary school around sort of the age of sort of 12, and that's the point where churches often feel a massive drop off in their sort of young people don't make that transition over, and they don't feel as though they belong in that church anymore. They feel as though they've outgrown the sort of the kids ministry and then drop out. Have you got any sort of comments or top tips for churches to sort of manage that transition so that those young people feel as though they really belong in the church as they get older?
Yeah. Well, and this is where there's an interesting relationship between belonging and the question we'll talk about next, which is purpose. And I'll go ahead and weave that in to this discussion about belonging, because I think they really go hand in hand with the question you just asked. And by the way, the drop off for us in the US is it can be 11, 12, 13, especially if a church or a denomination or tradition has confirmation. And so kind of there's this big push to get through confirmation, and then there's a drop off. We also tend to see it when kids get their driver's licenses at age 16, and that's when there's new opportunities. And so we actually have two major drop off points here in the US. So I think for that 11 or 12-year-old or that 14 or 15-year-old, you're starting to realize you can make a difference. You're not just a receiver, you can be a giver. Church isn't just done to you or for you, it's done with you. And I think that preposition really, really matters. And so, what I love saying to a church or to a leader or a parent who's concerned about their kids drifting, rightly so, is, okay, how can your kid somehow use their gifts and be involved? How can your kid develop a sense of purpose from being involved in the church? Because often our sense of connection, our sense of belonging increases when we're serving alongside others, when we're rubbing shoulders with others. And whether it's doing, tech and sound at a church, whether it's greeting, whether it's setting up snacks, whether it's serving in the children's ministry, whatever it might be, we see kids who come to feel like the church is ours or mine and not just my parents or my family's if they have a role. What was interesting in the pandemic, our middle kid, the one who's coming to London soon, she was 17 at the time when the pandemic hit here in the US. And all of a sudden, I don't know what it was like over on your side of the Atlantic Ocean, but all of a sudden here in the US, like teenagers had more time. I mean, they were bored and they were doing school at home by Zoom, but they had time. And so my daughter, the super busy high school student until the pandemic, like had a lot of time. And Dave and I, my husband and I, we loved it because we got more time with our kids. We had longer family dinners, et cetera. But I also reached out to our one of the pastors at our church and said, hey, Krista's got time and she's pretty good on social media. What would you think about asking her to help out with the church and social media? Now, my daughter didn't know that I did this. I literally stood in front of our house and called my pastor so that she didn't hear. And so sure enough, Perry reached out to her and Perry's colleague, Julia, reached out to her. And Krista started serving as like a social media intern for our church during the pandemic. She would spend about an hour or two a week posting things, reposting things, designing things. When she got the password for the high school ministry's Instagram account, I could tell she thought like this big deal. I'm kind of hot stuff. I got the password. And it really helped Krista stay engaged. She also started filming our church's worship services because, we were filming things and then live streaming it and putting it on YouTube and all. And in fact, just this past week, she was talking to the person who oversees our church's video. And she said, yeah, I told Steve I'd help out again at Christmas. And so, when I'm here at Christmas, I'll come and film. So, part of what helps our daughter stay connected is what she did with social media, what she did with filming. And I've seen that with our other kids too. And I see that with kids constantly. So, that 11 or 12-year-old, like, what are their passions? What are their gifts? And how can we use those in meaningful ways where they don't feel like a spectator? They don't feel like they're in the stands. They feel like they're on the field of the church. So.
Kara, I noticed there, as a mum, you made that move to your church and got involved. It's the kind of thing I sort of do. But not every parent is as switched on, as engaged as you are. I'm just wondering if you could sort of comment on the sort of role between the parent and the sort of the youth worker and how you see that as a healthy relationship.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah. And even as I was calling Perry, our pastor, I said, I might be being a helicopter parent here right now. I might be over involved. It's totally possible. But I feel like this is important. And so I did it. Because I think parents, the family, and the church need to be in more communication about young people's faith formation. There's a great ministry headquartered here in the US. I know it has some connection in Britain, but that's called Orange. And the belief of Orange is that the yellow is the light of Christ in the church and the red is the heart of love in the family. And how do we bring yellow and red together? How do we bring church and family together so that young people benefit? And so, I hope that the leaders who are watching this, that you reach out to parents periodically and step parents and guardians and grandparents, and you say, hey, what are you seeing in your kid? How can I be praying for you? Here's what I'm seeing. Let me encourage you. What are your kids' gifts? And is there a way that we can use those in our church? How is your kid feeling about belonging? How much do they feel like they're part and that they fit in our church? And what can we do to even make that more? So leaders initiate with parents. Parents initiate with leaders. Like, don't wait for your pastor, your small group leader to reach out to you. Like, go ahead and reach out yourself and say, here's what I'm seeing. How can I be praying for you and your church? What can I do to support you? Here's what we're concerned about. Here's what we're loving about what we see God do in our kids. So yeah, it really needs to be a lot of conversations and reciprocity. I'm glad you asked that, Aika.
I think those roles for young people in the church are really important. I'm just wondering if people wanted to throw in the chat some of the stuff that young people do in your church. I know that I went to a meeting of vicars in North London recently. We call it a synod. It was a chapter. I asked people to put their hand up if they had young people serving in communion. And half the churches had young people part of the serving teams in communion. So I thought it was really interesting. That's been a real growth space. And young people really appreciate being asked. They really appreciate being asked to do something which in a lot of churches is the most important thing we do.
Yeah.
And so it feels to them a really big deal that the church has asked them to be part of it. They've not just been asked to, give out a leaflet or do something. The potential to cause harm is there, being part of the communion team, but the church are asked them to do it.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. Here in the US, we're, and I'm sure you're all navigating this too, we're talking so much about digital church and digital worship and digital discipleship. And so there are seminars and there are, webinars and there are master classes and all this. And I think that's great training. We at Fuller are offering some of that. But here's the thing. The experts are in our midst, the 14 and the 18 and the 23-year-olds who are already connecting in community using their devices, who are way more in touch with what's happening digitally. They can be our consultants. They can be our pioneers. They can be our dialogue partners as we figure out how do we do, hybrid, digital, relational, face-to-face, kind of all of it, community and worship in the future. So
Debbie's saying in their church, the young people are effectively leading their own version of junior church, which sounds excellent.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome. Great. Inspired by this question of purpose, a youth pastor, she totally switched her mentality. She said she used to feel like I offer programs for kids. They show up and I've done the preparation and it's ready for them and they participate in it. But instead, thanks to thinking more about purpose, which I know we can unpack a little bit further in a moment. She said, now they're putting on the youth ministry. They're the ones creating the service activities. They're the ones leading worship for us. And to the point that their church had a business meeting and teenagers came with amendments they wanted to offer for the topics being discussed, because they had totally clicked from this is for you or to you to this is with you and by you. And that is a doable change for any church and any church size. In fact, I actually think the smaller the church, the easier it is to make that click, to make that switch, because kids more, you can figure out their gifts more. It's not kind of like this machine that a larger church can be. So those of you in smaller churches, man, you have an advantage in this, in looking at, the handful, the dozen of young people who are in your community and saying, okay, how can we help Emma get more involved? How can we help Thomas feel like he has a place here? I'm talking to Emma and Thomas's families about that, et cetera. From a smaller church, you have a head start and big advantage in this.
So I'm wondering now, how do you go about making that switch? So if you're here tonight and going, yeah, we want to do that, where would you start?
Yeah. Well, gosh, I'm going to sound like a broken record because I think this is going to be the third time I've answered a question by first saying, listen to young people. Start by talking to young people and seeing what they're passionate about. I love that Debbie has a chat room. That's fantastic. Maybe there are young people in your community who are really passionate about climate change, or who are really passionate about kids, or who are really great. And so, they can help in your children's ministry or help with some of your outreach, or who are really passionate about technology, or are really passionate about worship and rituals. And as Sam said so well, communion could be really meaningful to them, or really passionate about good discussions. And so they can help think about, how do we make better discussions in our church? It starts what we needed to do with Krista, the one I talked about, and what we've done before with Nathan, our oldest, and what we're working through with Jessica, our youngest, is like, what are their talents, their passions, and how do we help them take a step forward? So I would say, that can be done through a one-on-one conversation, or just knowing what a kid is into and saying, hey, you know what? I know that you're really great at soccer, or as you all would say, football. See a little cross-cultural sensitivity there. Our church, we have so many kids in our neighborhood who also play football, and we were thinking about starting a community team on Saturday. Would you help us with that? And so, you're starting with what is a kid good at? And then the great thing is, so many of those service opportunities provide mentoring between, that 15-year-old and an older adult. So in my case with Krista, she got connected with Perry and Julia, who were helping run the ministry. And so they're the ones who worked with her on social media. For that 13-year-old who's helping out with some kind of soccer outreach in the neighborhood, well, great. There's probably a 22-year-old or a 32-year-old who can start investing in that 13-year-old. So it's listening, really prioritizing and centering around what kids are interested in, and then thinking about, how do we create these adult connections so that mentoring happens too.
Brilliant, thank you.
Definitely pause. We're both looking for each other. Let's do that. There's one final question I quite like in this, about just how do we, the question, I didn't write this question, it's a good one, about how does God's story invite and equip young people into that purpose? Is there?
Yeah. So what we saw in the interviews we did, with the deep interviews with the 27 kids, the good news is, when it comes to purpose, that a lot of kids are serving already. And U.S. kids in our sample, they're involved in scouts, they're involved in their church, they're helping at their school, etc. A lot of times it felt like, and they would often verbalize, they're doing it because they know it looks good on their college application, because their family wants them to, because their church or their teacher expects them to, etc. And there's all these reasons that they're doing it. And so what we felt like with purpose is, the good news is, for kids, for a lot of kids, like, the behavior's happening. It's the attitude and the motivation that's driving the behavior where we need to do some refining. And so when it comes to Jesus' best answer, what we want young people to know is they're part of God's unfolding story. So all of us are, God's got this unfolding story. All of us have a page. For that 15-year-old, they have just a paragraph on their page. For those of us who are older, we have more paragraphs. And our part in life is to understand the part that God wants us to play in God's unfolding story. And this is where, again, we as adults, we journey alongside young people, or as some of my Catholic friends say, we accompany young people. I love that verb. We accompany young people in this process. So of helping them understand God's story, which involves teaching and reflection, and then the part that they play in it. So a friend of mine who actually leads Orange, the ministry that I mentioned a few moments ago, that's church and family together, he says this. He says, a kid may forget what I teach them, but will never forget what God does through them. And I think there's something powerful there. We've all forgotten. I love the Bible. I love God's word. I love teaching God's word. I love being transformed by God's word. And I've heard some really good talks and then forgotten them. I've given some talks and forgotten the talk myself. But we don't forget when God changes us to somehow impact our world. So the more we can lean into that, the better. So
that's a great question from Kerry in the chat there about her group feel a bit apathetic about don't seem to have hobbies or things they really want to get engaged with. Is there a sense of, do we just say, well, fair enough, or is there a way we could well just sit there, or is there a way of trying to engage them anyway?
Carrie, I'm so glad you said that. I can't tell you how many times I've offered a service opportunity for our kids and, just a few show up and I'm disappointed. So as much as kids like to serve, why is it that they sometimes don't serve? Because both things seem to be true. So with the situation that you're talking about, where you've got a youth group that's unchurched, aren't passionate about anything and don't have hobbies or belong to anything else, I would start small. And I would say, gosh, are there one or two in your group? Are there one or two kids who actually do have a bit of a spark? And in fact, this is actually what the Search Institute calls it, a spark, a passion, an ability, an interest. Is there something that they are kind of interested in? And again, there's that thread. And can we pull at it and start small? Like, let's say one of your kids is really likes film and loves thinking about film, loves shooting film, etc. Well, there's a thread there. Maybe you go to a film together and that somehow prompts a conversation. Maybe you have a need where, gosh, we'd really love to capture something on film. You're so good at it. Can I take you out to coffee and we can talk about it? And you take the kid out to coffee and then all of a sudden they become more interested in it. Well, gosh, can you help us next Saturday and maybe bring a friend? And so, it's funny, I keep saying pulling a thread. I don't often say that, but so maybe it's the Lord, but like, what is it that you can pull at? And so, yes, your group of 7 or 8 or 12 kids, you might look at them and think, gosh, there's not a lot of sparks here. But if you reduce down and look at, okay, who are 1 or 2 kids where we can start? And maybe they'll bring a few more, or maybe they'll start talking about it, or maybe it just becomes known. So I would say start small and start with sparks.
It's interesting in the chat, Debbie's kind of responded that sometimes kids don't want to stand out and be different.
Yeah.
So are there any sort of things you can do to the whole group?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple thoughts. Number one, a lot of this isn't like, hey, here's a kid doing something in front of 12 other kids. Like my daughter did social media and people didn't really know. She was posting from the high school ministry account. Like people didn't know unless she told them that she was the one posting. So a lot of this can be done without calling attention to oneself. But again, if a kid can invite or bring along another friend or two, kids bringing kids is always such a positive and helpful approach. So if that one kid that you asked to help with a children's program at your church and say, gosh, can you bring one other kid? And I'll tell you what, I'll take you out for burgers on the way home. Or fish and chips, again, trying to be more cultural sensitive.
Burgers these days, Shake Shack is here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's all about fish and chips used to be much cheaper, but Five Guys is now the future.
Five Guys. Do you have In-N-Out yet, though? I don't think you do.
I don't think we do.
Okay, that's kind of a Chipotle, nice, Levi. That's kind of a Western U.S. thing. That's pretty big burgers here. So, Popeyes, all right, man. Talk about the globalization of our world. Oh, Chick-fil-A flopped. Interesting. Well, anyway, now I'm wanting fish and chips since we're talking about this. So I'm going to have to go find some English restaurant and get some good fish and chips. But
can you bring yourself to put vinegar on the chips? I gather with Americans, that's a bit offensive.
I like vinegar on the chips. Yeah, I have ketchup too. Is that okay to have ketchup and vinegar?
Well, normally it makes your mum cross because you pay extra for ketchup in the UK. Normally 10p a sachet. So mum is very much, I ain't paying for that. I've already bought you chips and a can of pop.
Got it. Well, see, we didn't get a can of pop, so that settles that. Like we were not growing up. We were not a you get a drink family. You get your meal and that's it. No drink, no dessert. So we were pretty streamlined with that. What were we talking about? Oh, burgers.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, hey, look, can you help me with this thing at church? Let's do this thing together. I've seen how good you are with your younger brother. I've seen how great you are with your cousin. Would you do this thing on Sunday afternoon for an hour? And then we'll go name your favorite food from chat together. And then I'll drop you off. And, that's, again, that thread that you pull on. So baby steps add up. And sometimes the door is going to shut. Like, oh my gosh, and how many times have I spent time with a kid and it's gone nowhere? But sometimes it goes somewhere. So.
Great. Shall we move on to some of these questions? We're just sort of running towards the end of our time. So
Perfect.
do you want to, Ike, do you want to choose one of them?
Yeah, I'm going to, Anushka sort of mentions, obviously your research is about US kids, and she wonders whether there's some sort of cultural nuances and factors that affect responses. You know, if you did the same research in the UK, we wonder, you know, if things would be largely the same or a little bit different.
Yeah, great question. So, boy, as a researcher and as an American, because we have certainly been very colonial in our past, I'm pretty tentative about making statements about, you know, what we experience in the US is probably fairly common in, say, Britain, you know, and where there's obviously so much history and there is cultural overlap in our countries. So I can't say for sure, and I'm very tentative. And given the incredible ethnic diversity of our sample, including some recent immigrants from different parts of the world, and given that so much research literature talks about identity, belonging, and purpose, I am more confident than normal that identity, belonging, and purpose have cultural relevance across the board, not just in the US. So how is that for a very qualified researchy answer? But
and I have to say, if you think about our kids are exposed to so many things globally now through
totally
and everything, you know, they're probably all doing the same TikTok dances that they're doing over in the States. So there are I think more cultural kind of similarities than perhaps there was just even 5 or 10 years ago.
I would say that it feels very similar. I mean, if we were in a room now, people could do a general nod and because in Britain that's as best you're going to get. But I think in the chat, if you want to say what you think, you know, reflect on how you feel your young people that you work with, or your own children, I would say this feels very, very similar. It feels like it would help a great deal for where we are in the UK.
Yep. And that is my strong hunch, Sam. And that's certainly, as we've done kind of anecdotal conversations like this, wise people like you have said that sort of thing, as well as Ika, like you pointed out, there's just a flattening of our world as it's been described. And a shrinking of our world. Thank you, Tola. Very well said.
But I have to say, I read the book from the BBC Washington correspondent who's just coming back, and he said that the problem in America is they speak English. If they didn't, we'd know just how different they are. And they fool us by speaking English to making us think we're like them, and we're not at all.
Fascinating.
Collection of living in. I thought it was such an interesting. Anyway, it's not what we're talking about. I want to ask you Carl's question. He says, my role is looking after the generations, and my dream is to have a church with leaders and people serving throughout the ages, but our church isn't built for that. What are your top tips to change culture in a church and help them get on board with intergenerational church?
Yeah. Is it fair to assume the church is maybe skewing older? Would that be fair to assume? Or, I mean, I know that's kind of the norm in the US. So the typical church, no, Carl says no. Okay, great. Well, that's fine. I was going to use that slightly as an illustration, but I don't have to. So we spend a lot of time, Carl, you're asking such an important question because we've talked largely about what needs to change today. The how do you bring about change question is actually a more challenging and longer term question. So I'm gonna share two things, two principles, and we've worked with 600 churches, and we're actually right now training some churches in Scotland in this very process. And I'm going to share two of the principles that I think are most important. Number one is people tend to support what they create. People tend to support what they create. And so if there's a way to involve others, whatever change and this is true professionally, this is true in your family, when you're thinking about where you're going to go for the holiday, or where you're going to go for dinner or for dessert or fish and chips or whatever it might be. People tend to support what they create. So the more that we can involve people, get input from people, make it a we, the better. And so smart churches spend a lot of time listening, building relationships, having discussions, and so that people feel like they're a part of the change vision. The other thing, I just mentioned vision. So that's the second thing. My colleague at Scott Cormode, he has my favorite definition of vision is shared story of future hope. It's a shared story of future hope. And so some of what we walk through with churches is like, take a 13-year-old in your church right now, and what is your vision for how your church would influence them? Like, how would you want them to be surrounded by the generations? How would you want them to be getting their identity, belonging, and purpose questions answered? Can you write that out in a half a page or a 3/4 page? And can you start sharing it? Like, some churches stop right there and they take a kid or two and they paint the picture, and it's helpful for everybody to kind of have that and lean into. Other churches, like, we've tracked with churches where every young person in their ministry, their parent or a mentor, like, writes a picture of their future, which then almost becomes a discipleship plan. So regardless of how much you emphasize it, the power of story. If I was to bump into any of you tomorrow, odds are good. And I would say, what's something you remember from what we talked about? Odds are good. It would either be fish and chips, because we spent a little bit of time on that, or it would be some kind of story that came up. And so stories, just like Jesus modeled, stories have amazing power in change. So people tend to support what they create, and vision is a shared story of future hope.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have we got time for a couple more questions, Sam?
Yes, I'm just looking at them. Just had a few more pop up, and then Levi shuffled them, and now I've lost where I was. Right. Do you have it's a question about restarting youth ministry? A few of our churches are still in the process of coming back post-pandemic.
Oh.
Any particular tips?
Yeah.
Going again.
Involve kids in figuring out what to do. So I think that one of the biggest mistakes we can make as adults is say, all right, everybody, here's what I've decided, or what those of us over 30 have decided we're going to do. There's never been a better chance to experiment, to reinvent, to listen. This is the best opportunity of all. In 30 years of doing youth ministry, there's never been a better chance to really reset and reimagine. And so I'd spend some time listening to kids. What do they want it to be? What did they love about before? What would they wish to change about before? How are they doing with their identity, belonging, and purpose? What possibilities do they see in the community? And, have a lot of conversations over coffee or tea, and see what emerges as young people help create it. So that's my fundamental. Involve young people.
One more about questions from Ruth, who is involved in schools ministry, which in the UK is something that quite a lot of us have done. And this ties in with some research that Youthscape did actually into asking young people, going into school, say, any questions about faith, and the answer was nope, not really. And so she's asking, having had that experience in school herself, which, as I say, is common in the UK.
Yeah.
Have you got any questions about any thoughts about how you might be able to sort of get beyond that and begin a conversation?
So, I think it depends on how well you know the person, but I will just say my two favorite questions to ask my own kids and teenagers, if I have some relationship with them, is what do you no longer believe about life or faith that you think I still do believe? And what do you now believe that you think I don't believe? So that it's being totally overt, like faith changes, you're changing. And so, what's your no now that's still my yes? And what's your yes now that you think is probably my no? Because those things exist, and I would way rather talk about them. But that has to be a kid who kind of, knows you at least well enough to know what you think. If it's a kid you don't know as well, I love asking this. If you could ask God any question, what would it be? If you could ask God any question, what would it be? And some kids say, I don't really have any, but other kids, because I think it's different asking about God than faith. So I think if we can focus more on God and questions about God, I think that could be more generative.
And for the child that then says, but I don't believe in God.
Yeah. Then I would say, tell me more about that.
Yeah. Yay.
And I've, because you don't want to say why. Oh, really? Why not? Like, why can sound judgmental. Or, okay, wow, I'm curious. Tell me more about that.
Fabulous.
Good. I'm glad you asked that, Aika. Thank you.
We're just about out of time, aren't we?
We are. I think we are. Kara, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And yeah, it's been brilliant to get your top tips. Before you go, though, we'd really like to pray for you. So is there something that we can pray for you and your work right now?
Oh, great question.
Your family.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said family, because honestly, my girls are navigating some challenging circumstances and stress. And so they're experiencing Jesus in the midst of it, but I would really love for Jesus to just draw them close. So for my daughters to experience Jesus in the midst of what they're navigating would be great, please.
Okay. I'll pray.
Thank you.
God, just thank you for this time that we've had with Kara. Lord, I thank you for all the research she's done and the wisdom. And Lord, we're parents as well. And Lord, I just thank you for Kara, that she will really know that she is enough. She's more than enough in her parenting as well as in her work life. And we just lift before you her daughters. And we really pray that, Lord Jesus, you would shine a light into their trickier situations, and that they would really know that you are walking along with them in this part of their journey of life and faith. And Lord, we really pray for Kara and her husband, that you will give them the right conversations to really encourage and equip and love their children. And we just ask for your Holy Spirit to help us in all of this, because we know we can't do this by ourselves. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Wow. Thank you all. This has been awesome. Thank you.
Just a final plug for us. If you come away thinking we need to talk to the young people in our church and listen, then if you're in London, myself and my team with Joy and Katie, and then in Southwark, Aika or Kelly, we would love to help. We've got loads we can do to help. So do give us a shout. Do get in touch. We are here to help. We are here to help through this difficult process of getting started again. And listening to young people is so important. So we'd love to help you with that. But thank you, Kara. Thanks for your time this evening. Thanks, guys, for coming.
Brilliant.
And we'll see you again soon.
Yeah. Take care. Good night.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.